for UFC 219, the trilogy fight. That is part of their plan. That is a goal of theirs. Now, I believe Dana White isn't technically lying when he says it's not true that the fight's booked, that bout agreements are signed, that everything's ready to go. Like I believe that is not true. I don't believe that Conor Nate 3 is a done deal, bout agreement signed, venues figured out, none of that stuff. Like that, I believe Dana when he says that part's not true. But I do believe that they're targeting it. And I love it. I think that's a trilogy that we all knew was going to happen at some point, and we all knew Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz were going to clash a third time. Hell, when the first two times they clashed, they're two of the biggest pay-per-views ever, and the second time they clashed, it is the biggest pay-per-view ever. And they go 1-1 against each other. You know they're doing a trilogy. Like that's a no-brainer. Like, you only have to watch combat sports for about 5 minutes to know that that's how it works, which is fine. A couple stipulations though that I want to see to keep this from being a complete mess. I want it to be at 170 again. Their first two fights were at 170, so it makes sense to make the third fight at 170. And I also want it to be a non-title fight, which obviously if it's at 170, it is. The winner of Tony Ferguson versus Kevin Lee coming up at UFC 216 next month is going to crown the interim champion. Obviously, the winner of that fight fights Conor next, or should fight Conor next at some point. What's the other point of having an interim title? So if you do Conor versus Nate 3, I'm afraid that the UFC is going to try to make this a title fight, which I don't want to see. You don't need it. You make up fake title fights for crappy pay-per-views to get an extra 10,000 buys. You don't put together fake title fights when it's a pay-per-view that they're aiming to do 2 million pay-per-view buys. It's just unnecessary. You don't need to do that. Don't spit on your belts so much where you make this a title fight. Nate's lost, 4 of his last 7 or something like that? 3 of his, he's like 3-4 in his last 7. He shouldn't be in a title fight with Conor McGregor.
Kevin Lee shouldn't be in a title fight with Tony Ferguson.
I mean, Khabib is the one you want, but that's fallen apart 3 times. Like, who would you put over Kevin Lee other than Khabib?
I mean, Nate Diaz isn't going to take a fight against anybody else. I just think that your point about it not, like, I don't see why we would do this fight at 170 again. I just think that Conor McGregor is a lightweight champion. Whether you believe Nate Diaz deserves a title shot or not, the trilogy is a natural thing to happen. Nate is actually a 155er. Let's just make it a title fight. Make it a title fight. And Nate beat Conor. He did. And he barely lost to him the last fight. So I don't think it's that insane for Nate Diaz to get a title shot. Just like there's been lots of crazy title shots. Like, this is not even one of the crazier ones for me.
It would be the 3rd or 4th dumbest title fight.
But you have Diaz deficient. You have a chip on your shoulder about the Diaz brothers.
I have no chip. I have the facts.
Now.
I have the facts. He's coming off of a loss. He's lost 4 of his last 7. That's a fact. That has nothing to do with. I could love Nate Diaz or I could hate Nate Diaz. He's coming off of a loss. He's lost 4 of his last 7. When there's better guys. Like that's the thing. Like, if there was no Tony Ferguson, if there was no Khabib Nurmagomedov, if there was no Kevin Lee, if there weren't 7 guys ahead of Nate Diaz that have a better claim for a title shot than Nate, it wouldn't be a big deal. But there's 7 guys ahead of Nate Diaz that have a better title shot claim. And one amazing one, whoever comes out of the Tony Ferguson-Kevin Lee fight.
Kevin Lee's most impressive win was Michael Chiesa.
And if he beats Tony Ferguson, it's going to be Tony Ferguson.
He's not going to beat Tony Ferguson.
I don't think so either. So great. So now it's Tony Ferguson. So you have in so many weight classes you have questions and you're not sure who should be the contender, and it's kind of murky, or everyone's coming off losses. Like, in some weight classes that's how it is. Not at lightweight. There's a true number 1 contender that should be fighting for it.
Understood.
And if it's anybody else, it's wrong.
Yeah, but you have to understand that for Conor McGregor coming off a loss against Floyd Mayweather, the UFC is going to want to put him in a position to have his best odds. And I'm not saying that Nate isn't a great fighter, because he is, but Nate Diaz is someone that Conor's already seen. The trilogy is a natural thing to happen. If you're going to do it, we cannot put the lightweight division on hold anymore. You got to at least call it a title shot. I don't care.
I'd rather it be put on hold than bastardized with a BS title fight.
Welcome to the UFC. Titles are bastardized.
That's why I'm trying to fix it. Not this bad. Not this bad. Other than Chael Sonnen getting the title shot against John Jones and Nick Diaz getting a title shot against George St. Pierre.
First of all, wait.
This might be the 3rd worst.
First of all, Nate Diaz is ranked 6th currently. Eddie Alvarez.
He's losing.
Eddie Alvarez, number 3, coming off of a loss. Edson Barboza, isn't he coming off of a loss?
No, he's coming off a win.
Is he? Justin Gaethje. I would love Justin Gaethje, but he's doing the Ultimate Fighter with Eddie Alvarez. Kevin Lee's ranked lower than Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz just hasn't been around because he's
look at you using the rankings like there's some something written in stone that actually is worth a crap. How often do we shit on the rankings? And yet when it's convenient for you, let's go by the rankings.
Look,
how about we go by the only thing that matters? Wins and losses. When it comes to getting title fights, that's what should matter.
Khabib.
And in this case, let him take the fight. Let him do the monster fight. Let him do 2 million pay-per-view buys. Let them each get their $20 million. That's great. That's wonderful. That's fine. Totally fine. Go do it. The fans want to see it. It's going to be great. Leave the title out of it. It doesn't belong. Not with Nate Diaz. At least right now.
If Khabib wanted to Khabib hasn't fought, right? First it was Ramadan, now injuries, whatever it is that's keeping Khabib from fighting. Tony Ferguson's chomping at the bit. He's going to fight. He should have just waited on the reason why Tony Ferguson isn't waiting is because he knows that the UFC is never going to give him a fight against Conor McGregor, especially after he's been away from the sport, boxing. They're going to give him Nate because they think he's the give me fight, even though Nate beat him once. So they're doing
the Nate fight. They're doing the Nate fight because it's the money fight.
No,
period.
That's not
End
why.
of story.
I think that's part of it.
It's period. End of story. It's the biggest fight you could make in MMA, pretty much.
Sure,
right?
But it's
Conor
also
versus Nate.
In their mind the safest fight. For
Nate choked him unconscious. How is it the safest fight? He's literally the only guy in the UFC to beat him. How is it the safest fight?
Because I'd rather the devil I know than the devil I don't know. Is that the line? It's just a more familiar thing.
Conor McGregor has destroyed every single guy he's ever fought in the UFC. Destroyed. One-sided beatdowns. Everybody he's ever fought in the UFC. Except Nate Diaz.
Sure.
And you're saying Nate Diaz is the easy fight?
I'm saying
you're losing your mind. It's the money fight. It's the money fight, not the easy fight.
RJ, Khabib, okay, first of all, is a nightmare matchup for Conor McGregor. Nightmare matchup. Tony Ferguson has been unfreaking stoppable. Those two guys are so friggin' dangerous right now that Nate Diaz, despite even the fact that he's the only guy who beat Conor in the last however many years, is still the safest choice because of that's how good Tony Ferguson and Khabib are right now. It's
Conor McGregor has only gone after the biggest money fights. Whether that fight is good for him stylistically or bad for him stylistically. In history, and you can't argue this fact, he has only chased the biggest fight. When he beat chased Jose Aldo, right? The greatest featherweight of all time. Arguably the best fighter of all time under 170 pounds. He chased Jose Aldo. Why? Not because it was an easy fight, but because that's the biggest fight he could find. Then after that, he wanted the lightweight champion. RDA. On paper, a terrible matchup for him. But he chased it because that was the biggest fight at the time. He ended up not getting it because he got hurt. We all know the story. Floyd Mayweather, in a sport that's not even his, is a terrible matchup for him, but he chased it. Why? Because it's the biggest money fight. Conor goes for the biggest money fights. And right now, it is unquestionably Nate Diaz.
Absolutely, but the RDA fight was prior to him fighting the greatest boxer of our time in Floyd Mayweather. Conor McGregor will make a ton of effing money no matter who he fights. He could fight a gorilla in the middle of the octagon. He could fight...
See, now you're not thinking like a businessman. You're right. He can make 1.2 million buys fighting me. But he can make 2.2 million fighting Nate.
But the trilogy
goes after the money fight, period, end of story.
But the trilogy's there no matter what. The trilogy is there no matter what.
You know what this tells me?
That's why the UFC...
You know what this tells me? That I think he's thinking about retirement then. He's getting the trilogy fight out of the way, and then maybe George St. Pierre, and then I think he washes his hands of it. That's what this tells me. This tells me Conor he's had this trilogy with Nate Diaz, like you said, in his back pocket ever since they fought the second time. And he's cashing that card now because I think he's getting out of the game.
Well, you know what? That would go to a conversation I had with Steve Cofield the other day. Who was the worst UFC champion of all time or had the worst reign? It would then become Conor McGregor. Hands down, unquestionably.
It's still Jermaine Durand to me. You can't beat Jermaine Durand to me. She literally wins the title, and in her post-fight speech, she's like, I don't want to fight the number one contender. In fact, I don't want to fight in this weight class again. Y'all can take this belt. Bye, bitches. I know for a fact, through sources of my own, that the UFC definitely is targeting Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor for UFC 219, the trilogy fight. That is part of their plan. That is a goal of theirs. Now, I believe Dana White isn't technically lying when he says it's not true that the fight's booked, that bout agreements are signed, that everything's ready to go. Like I believe that is not true. I don't believe that Conor Nate 3 is a done deal, bout agreement signed, venues figured out, none of that stuff. Like that, I believe Dana when he says that part's not true. But I do believe that they're targeting it. And I love it. I think that's a trilogy that we all knew was going to happen at some point, and we all knew Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz were going to clash a third time. Hell, when the first two times they clashed, they're two of the biggest pay-per-views ever, and the second time they